Good. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to your seminar. I'm looking forward to share a few insights and thoughts and get into a discussion with you about your ideas and experiences. Just a second. So, transforming the archive, museological exploration and curatorial strategies. I want to talk with you about innovation strategies and guidelines and findings from researching the field of AI in museums. And you can also find, as mentioned, many resources open access online. So let's dive into the question what innovation can mean in cultural heritage. So innovation can be seen as a multi-stage process whereby organizations transform ideas into new, improved products, services, or processes to advance, compete, and differentiate themselves successfully in their marketplace. This occurs in multi-stakeholder environments defined as innovation ecosystems. And we learn that policies play a key role in steering innovation, for example, for the EU level, as well as global trends. So let's have a look at some current innovations and policies and see if we get a step further here. What does innovation mean in museums? And do we really need it at all? A brief look at the museum's history helps here. Innovation in the museum can mean that the chambers of art and curiosities are not just for the court, but for the public. Innovation can mean that the public appropriates the museum and builds its own museums, as in the long 19th century. Innovation can mean that technological changes made the subject of collections and education, or that museums join together in associations, organize themselves, and engage in politics. Innovation can mean conducting research on museums and thus making progress in knowledge, for example, through visitor research. Innovation can mean focusing on non-visitors and experimenting with new formats, for example, outreach. Or it can mean constructing new buildings and creating new access to culture. And innovation can mean adopting values and renegotiating fundamental orientation. It might be useful to remember that, in current times we live in a datafied society and have been living in a generative culture for almost at minimum 2 years. 90% of the world's data has been produced in recent years, and we have now reached a limit. Machine-generated data outweighs human-generated data. What does that mean for us? We wear smartphones, smartwatches, we track steps and cycles, we share walking routes, book online, date online, learn online, work online. We agree to cookies and have logins and personalized profiles. We are tracked with our feelings and preferences, and we are analyzed, and we look for virtual friends. So access to the world has changed fundamentally over the past 15 years. So I think we are in the midst of a very important transformation, socially, culturally, and technologically. AI technologies, not only AI, but they are fundamentally changing the conditions for image, video, audio, and text production, and are influencing communication cultures, working conditions, and cultural concepts. AI technologies have an increasing influence on media, education, and cultural productions. We can observe avatars as newsreaders, AI-generated radio, and artistic and creative work is being expanded and given new possibilities through technology. We know examples of Holocaust survivors being made to speak again, destroyed writings being reconstructed, and thus an expansion of culture being created. Museums are exhibiting AI-generated artworks or artworks that take AI as their subject. The best known are perhaps Refik Anadolu or Kate Crawford or Obvious, or if you have an art historical perspective, Michael Knoll, who already created computer-generated art in the 1960s. These transformations raise ethical questions. On the one hand, there are aesthetic issues, like the question of whether AI-generated productions are art and what consequences this has for our understanding of creativity. But there are also consequences for production conditions and the self-image of artists, or new co-creative roles between humans and machines. Furthermore, ethical questions arise in relation to training data, data protection, knowledge production, personal rights, intellectual property, and transparency. Perhaps the biggest transformation is the shift to a data-driven society in which more and more information is available online. So for the first time, the internet is the most important source of news for the majority of the adult online population in Germany. At the same time, concerns about fake news are particularly high. So 41% of users of TikTok have difficulties distinguishing between trustworthy and unreliable news. So what roles can take museums here? And as we know that one of the biggest assets of museum is trust, as we learned from museum research. According to the philosopher Julia Nieder-Rümelin, who's also based in Munich, the biggest challenge of education in these days is to transform the trend from a data economy to a knowledge society. So we can actively reflect on the role that cultural institutions and museums can and should play in that process. So what does, for example, what does the new culture produced by AI mean to humans? What do we do with synthetically generated data, with vector spaces and multidimensional digital spaces? How do we move in an infosphere that is no longer organized in physical spaces, but in a networked global information infrastructure, in data economies and platform logics that thrive on metadata and micro-content? So how do we learn to think digitally? What forms of innovation do we need in museums today? And is it really artificial intelligence? So what could be our relationship to AI? We all know that technological progress is not an end in itself, but should ideally help us meet the challenges of our times. So talking about AI involves a promise of innovation, and we also know that it can be beneficial to remain very critical, cautious, ideologically sensitive, and sensitive in other ways. It makes sense to realize what power culture can have by picking up on narratives, making them visible, bringing them up for discussion, or deconstructing them. By looking at history, we can deconstruct the narrative of the simulation of the human brain. We can make the logics of the speaking, seeing, or singing machine visible. We can show the history of anthropomorphized machines and deconstruct the idea of transhumanism. We can show that people have always built tools to compensate for their deficits, and we can show that such tools also always bring about a change in communication or go hand in hand with an opening of society that is accompanied by often insecurities and doomsday fantasies. So I don't want to make a relativistic historical argument here. We don't know where we are heading with the current developments in artificial intelligence. So we know that from promises of salvation, global dimensions of competition, warnings of danger on the scale of a nuclear bomb, to post-humanist ideas, it's really all there. So what are we dealing with? I think we're dealing with a technology that is highly diverse in itself and is to be understood as a tool, a service that is currently subject to political regulation, that goes hand in hand with powerful market interests, with new technological possibilities that, and we have learned that from media history, is a crucial point of changing societies. So that technology is now accessible and available to a broad public. It is open in that sense. So a much broader public than 20 years ago is already shaping culture through technology. So what current fields of action, opportunities and limitations in museums can be observed? Let's have a look at the status quo. I think we can divide into several categories. So first, there are exhibition-based approaches. There are research-driven and data-driven collaborative approaches with merely external partners. There are communicative and education-based approaches, and there are collection implementation approaches. So on the one hand, for example, large and important exhibitions on the subject of AI can be seen in museums such as the Deutsches Museum Bonn, Museum der Arbeit, Hygienemuseum, Museum for Communication, and many more. There are experience centers such as Experimenta. They make AI an object of mediation, while art is mostly leading the way. So in art spaces like the GLAM or festivals like Ars Electronica, AI artworks have been systematically on display for years. These works of art and exhibitions create spaces for experiencing what AI means, how communication is expanding, and what new human-machine relationships are conceivable and possible. On the one hand, this makes it possible to experience the latest AI technologies, but also to discuss the risks and limitations, and opens up spaces to present the latest research or scientific findings to a wider audience. In addition to AI as a mediation topic, there are initial approaches to using AI in curating, like making algorithmic decisions about how and what content is shown. Several major projects, such as Intelligent Museum in Karlsruhe, the ZKM, in the ZKM, Training the Archive in Dortmund, Creative User Empowerment Project in Karlsruhe and Amsterdam, or Neo Collections in Hamburg, have focused on the field of curating, indexing, and mediation with AI in recent years, and have developed open source software that is available for reuse. This shows examples of how the indexing and curating process can be rethought and enriched. So the collection and research-based approaches focus on the following added values. As you can see here, it can enhance search and bring the interconnectivity of culture to the next level. You can use it for image analysis and restoration, so it makes it possible to improve image qualities, reconstruct missing parts, support the restoration of mosaics, for example, or predict styles, genres, artists, or analyze forged works of art. There are approaches for object recognition and classification. So computer vision and analysis of visual features or patterns can support the recognition and classification of objects. Architectural elements, patterns, sculptures can be classified, and metadata can be predicted, like colors, times, or materials. There are approaches about using translations and transcriptions. I think that's clear. So the technology can help to translate historical texts, inscriptions, and manuscripts. Text analysis and image analysis can be supported, or VR or AR can be created using AI to create immersive experience and virtual characters. So I just show here a few examples from open source repositories from the mentioned projects before. You can also find them all online and in the books I mentioned in the beginning. I think the challenges and limits are also known. A number of limitations could be identified from research and the activities of recent years. So Nevertheless, even if there are already exciting examples of how AI is being used in Germany and also around the world, we should not overestimate its broader impact in museum institutions. So a survey of global museum professionals from 2022, so it might have changed last year, but I think it's still valid, but that survey shows that only 18% of museum professionals use AI applications, whereas 71% do not. And the reasons are lack of skill or training, the costs of AI technologies, missing needs, or a lack of staff to conduct data-intensive methods. Another reason is the dependency on external partner. So also mentioned are often ethical consideration, like concerns about bias in AI technologies, lack of explainable technologies, or environmental arguments. So first, it's clear that AI models and processes require a high degree of customization for cultural processes. So many models are not simply out of the box, but require adaptation to specific domain requirements and clear metrics and measurement definitions. So let's take the recommender systems as an example. Do we and how do we measure user satisfaction, time spent with an artwork, number of artworks viewed, interaction rates, and how do we understand and deal with similarity? What type of similarity is relevant? And how useful are current similarity algorithms for a user experience that is interested in knowledge progress? We know from research that users interact most with content based on metadata and images. But we also know that metadata is handled very differently in museums and that museum collections are at a very different stage of digitization. So we still lack a majority of museum and collection data with sufficient metadata online. Secondly, the integration between AI systems and collection management or digital asset management systems is rarely happening. Search functionalities are still often limited and not user-friendly. And still many museums are not using standards and ontologies, which makes interoperability hard to achieve. If we want to access and improve collection data with AI and work with culturally specific information, high documentation expertise is required on the one hand, work with specific data sets and a transfer between tech, mediation, and documentation staff on the other. So a clear shortfall is personnel with technological development skills on the one hand and communication skills on the other that can translate between user needs and public, science, technology, and museum staff. So overall, more AI or data or also code literacy is needed, which involves a critical and enlightened understanding of AI as a tool, technology, but also as a transformation phenomenon and highly normative negotiation space. Secondly, there are still many gaps in terms of inclusion, because AI can actually help to make culture easier and more accessible for many people. But we need to make use of these possibilities in museums in a broader sense. In terms of inclusion and diversity, there is still a lot of potential for development, for example, to get culturally diverse information included in AI models and accessibility supported. This becomes clearest with the newer generative image models and image recognition. Here, it would make sense if the specific curatorial and specialist expertise were incorporated into the AI models for recognizing cultural assets. However, often transfer competence and communicative context are lacking here. So what kind of strategies do we have, and how can we develop domain-specific AI strategies? We've known all that from research and practice. So there is a national AI strategy, and individual federal states usually also have an AI strategy, but this often does not necessarily include culture. In some local state strategies, AI is seen often purely as an economic factor, and the cultural sector is not even mentioned. The only federal state that has been systematically working on an AI strategy together with the cultural sector for several years is Schleswig-Holstein. In Lower Saxony and North Rhine-Westphalia, AI is also being strategically addressed as a topic for culture by cultural policy players or foundation. In Germany, there is the German Cultural Council, which has written several position papers on AI in culture, but focuses strongly on copyrights and solely self-employed artists. The discussion about how artist rights are handled in foundation models and whether there should be corresponding payment models currently dominates. The political debate has primarily focused on a risk-based approach and regulation. And here too, the added value and cross-sectional strategies, which include the power of culture, have so far been little addressed. So a first necessary condition for developing AI strategies in museums might be to gain a better understanding of what we mean by AI. So a crucial foundation seems to be to accept the diversity within the technologies itself and not to reduce it to one model or one technology, as we can observe what happened to the language model discussion in the last year. And the second necessary condition seems to me to recognize the specific results produced by AI systems and not to fall into the misconception of comparing them to human thinking and human intelligence. So I think we must acknowledge the specific way of extracting information in the way of symbol processing and not confuse it with the generation of meaning and context and differentiate it from interpretation. So we might need to learn about the specific quality of digital thinking and AI-generated content. In general, so these are just some basic conditions for strategies. As I can observe in general, there are few or no explicit AI strategies in museums so far. So in Karlsruhe, we developed some guidelines together with user groups and staff, as well as in public discussions with the network, which I'm happy to share and which may serve as inspiration. Keep in mind that these guidelines were developed out of a practitioner perspective and not a theoretical perspective. The function of these guidelines was to collect and synthesize positions which seem to be important for the humans involved in the project. So this can serve as a building block, which needs to be further discussed if you think it's useful. So it should be noted that it makes sense to hold such discussions on AI strategies in a close collaboration with staff, as this can help to develop AI system in such a way that they are accepted and developed close to people and for people. These examples and strategies show and help to understand that the technologies and methods really deliver a clear advantage and an actual condition for the way we access art, culture, and research. And no new information, but I want to emphasize also on the examples I mentioned before, that there are already many open source tools developed specifically for museums and curation processes that can be reused and further developed. So I think it's particularly important in times of limited resources in this area to work together cooperatively in the cultural sector to set aside competition and instead share expertise, staff, cloud, and computing power, learnings, and results, as you do here. We even might need a new idea of working collaboratively together in terms of digital culture, also within institutions, and not work project and institutional based, but on a public digital and cultural infrastructure level. So in terms of digital strategies for museums, we should not only think in physical and location-based structures, but we need to intensify collaboration within cloud and data spaces about standard data and authority files like GND or big data, and standardized interoperability like IIIF or ICANN class to enable a trusted and networked knowledge culture. So I want to summarize some recommendations about what we need to develop innovations at museums if we assume that AI can help us here. So first of all, think digital. We need a basic understanding of the datafied world and the technologies and communication cultures we used to operate in. For this, we need an understanding as a learning institution that is prepared to adopt new skills, practices, and processes without immediately fearing a loss of power or the demise of the cultural West. In this respect, the opportunity for further training, networking, peer-to-peer learning, and on-the-job training is an important prerequisite that must be established much more strongly in terms of cultural policy. The idea of European AI Innovation Hub, as formulated by NEMO, the International Organizations of Museums, could be a good way forward here. Next, act digitally. So AI as a topic of social transformation that affects many areas and culture can help to make these processes easier to understand. It can make use of the technology itself, but it can also contribute to the necessary negotiation processes, for example, about data solidarity. To do this, we need the opportunity to open up spaces for experimentation, play with the possibilities without assuming in advance that we know the results. So have an agile understanding of development, try, fail, try again, and have a productive error culture. This also includes opening up spaces for experimentation and working together much more transdisciplinary and socially. So culture definitely needs to get out of its bubble. We need structures in which we can bring tech development together with culture on an equal footing. In other words, without reducing culture to a data provider or reducing it to a creative idea generator, but rather spaces in which culture is part of a critical technology discourse and helps to shape the technology itself. This seems to me a good way to reach an informed, trusted public digital cultural infrastructure. And the basics, still have to get to the basics. The data quality, because the groundwork is a necessary condition. Only with a good databases and a good scientific standards, we can develop innovations that make a sustainable contribution to a networked knowledge society that help, for example, to reconstruct historical events factually, that make stories come alive or put art history into a new light. Because honestly, how much time is spent in museums on tidying up data, persisting identifiers, authority files, and linking standard data. So introducing interoperability standards and supporting FAIR standards. What forms of sustainability do we support in museums? So I think we need also a political understanding of the effort required to clean up the data and the necessary resources, and an internal understanding of AI-generated results and their further processing. And to come to an end, I think we need, and I think I made that clear, we need much more networked understanding at a cloud tool and data level. So in terms of sustainability, we need a stronger understanding of shared data spaces instead of ivory towers, or of common FAIR and open standards, the reuse of open source solutions and cross-domain cooperations, for example, with information science institutions such as libraries and archives. To this end, An international, Europe-wide and cross-federal state perspective makes sense in order to avoid getting stuck in federal or funding logics. AI development and also implementation is expensive, and only a joint cooperative, solidarity-based and non-competitive perspective can help to develop innovations from a cultural, humanistic and intelligent perspective. And as conclusions, I think we can see museums in an AI-driven society out of the examples and the research as places where, in theory and practice, critical technology practice takes place, where cultural heritage is communicated innovatively and made accessible with a focus on cultural diversity. They can act as spaces and as creators, negotiation sites for the power of information technologies and offer critical media competence. They can be real-world laboratories, place of negotiation for AI technologies and the current state of research. They can definitely take a self-confident position with regard to the value of databases and specific skills of cultural professionals in a cultural sensitive descriptions, and hopefully be aware of the power of creative and innovative thinking. And that brings me to an end, and I'm really curious about your questions and getting into a discussion with you. Thank you very much.